Hey there, students. So this week, chapter 2, we're going to be looking at public opinion, the news media, and the crime problem. It's really interesting because so much of the information that we receive comes from the news media. And oftentimes students are kind of surprised that, this is the first thing that we go over in this course. One of the reasons for that is oftentimes our opinion of what, the way we see the world is very much influenced by the media. But unfortunately, the media isn't oftentimes giving us the most accurate or representative information. And as sociologists, we have to look little bit deeper to understand the reasons why. So the media is set up on a capitalistic model, right? Their number one um, goal is to make money. And so they are going to produce any type of strategy that will keep their viewers engaged, right? And you've probably noticed some of these. A lot of the cable news networks will use banners, people will talk really loud, the women will have low cut shirts and showing their legs, right? Anything that's going to keep you continually engaged, they're going to do it, right? And that also, it also reflects on the idea that they're going to use images and narratives and stories that are most sensational to keep your eyeballs engaged, not necessarily what's most likely to happen to you. So oftentimes the media will depend on violent crime as a way to engage and keep viewers watching. And so we've seen various strategies in which they'll do this, and so that's essentially what we're going to be covering for this chapter. So the chapter objectives will include understanding the relationship between public opinion and public policy, and being able to list the criticisms of democratic theory. We'll be able to evaluate the accuracy of news media coverage on crime and criminal justice. We'll be familiar with the over dramatization of crime, crime waves, and the over reporting of violent crime, crime myths, and other problems in media coverage. We'll appreciate the effects of media coverage, including public ignorance, public fear, and racial and ethnic stereotypes. So we'll see this interplay, happening in terms of how people come to perceive, what's going on out there via the media, right? And a lot of times, again, the media isn't giving you the full story, right? They don't give you, the history. They don't give you the structural inequalities. They don't give you that personal, inequality. I taught a class on drugs and society last year, and one of the biggest predictors of hardcore drug abuse, I'm talking about like the people out on the streets that we see, is childhood trauma. And if we actually understood that and we understood the whole story, we might treat these people a little differently because they've had really, really difficult lives in many ways. But rather, it's framed as they're a nuisance. And I understand that too. I understand why people are frustrated. Um, but again, if we're really going to try to fix this problem, we have to look at it sociologically. We have to look at it deeper. And there are no quick band-aid fixes with this stuff, right? It's incredibly awful what we're seeing. But, there aren't any quick fixes. It took us a long time to get where we were or where we are, and it's going to take us a long time to get out of it. And, looking at things a lot deeper could really help with that. But overall, we see this kind of these connections where people come to see criminals are bad people, right? You watch a show like Cops, and all you see is black folks committing crime. And adding to this, racially, we live in very segregated areas. In a lot of places in California or Washington, you can literally, like, there are lines that divide community streets where you're like, oh, you don't go down below this street, right? Um, and so what ends up happening is that white folks aren't really seeing what's going on in black communities. And maybe not even know any black folks at all. I mean, they're living in really segregated worlds, and all they're seeing is the media, right? And it shows black people committing crimes, and they're going, well, this must be what happens. And so I need to vote on really tough on crime policies. And so after the war on drugs, we started to see these really punitive policies being pushed through, things like mandatory sentences. Mandatory sentences took away discretion from judges. So essentially, if I was a judge and I had a young person in front of me who had straight A's and they're a really good kid, but they had gotten in trouble. Maybe they were spending the summer with a cousin, I don't know, and got into trouble. It wouldn't allow me as a judge to have use my own discretion in terms of sentencing this person. This person would get a mandatory minimum sentence. Um, and these sentences were a lot harsher than what we saw in the rest of the world, right? um, Also, three strikes laws. This was another big one that folks in California, folks in Washington, they voted on continually, because it kept getting brought up and they kept voting on it. Yes, we want it, we want it. And again, three strikes is this idea you get three shots, just like baseball. But what a lot of people didn't recognize, and again, the media is not telling you this, in the state of California, you only needed really two felonies, because your third strike, which could be a misdemeanor, and there are cases, I don't know how common this is, but there are cases where people were shoplifting and they get a 25, it's their third strike and they get 25 years to life or something like that. And so, keep in mind, we do have rapists and murderers who get out of jail, but you're thinking of, if you commit a drug felony twice, you're in jail for life or prison. And so, again, very harsh penalties. Truth in sentencing was another big one, and that really took away like time for good behavior. So it really didn't give incentive to folks to try to be good while they were in prison, because it didn't matter. And a lot of this, again, really based on opinions that were shaped by the media. And even like Black and brown folks were voting on these very punitive policies that really came to impact their own communities really, really harshly. So again, looking at this a little bit deeper, we also see, politicians using this over and over and over again to get elected, right? Because it makes them look instrumental. It makes them look like they're doing something. Look, I'm building you a wall. But even then, you think a wall is very one dimensional, right? There are folks that come from other places. They fly in and overstay their visas. Again, it's building a wall as a one-dimensional solution to a multi-dimensional problem. Um, and so, but we it's intriguing to watch. It's incredibly scary as well. But a lot of times, when you're trained as a sociologist, you can see it happening while it's happening, and that's really what I want to teach you guys to be able to kind of get a sense of. So we also see a lot of over dramatization of crime by the media, right? Because this is their money maker. Even things like high speed chases, right? That's really not what's probably most important to the society, but they know it's like the cat and mouse. Oftentimes we will stay engaged and watching because we want to see what happens to this person at the very end, right? We want to see the shootout. We want to, whatever it is, right? And so, there's a lot of those strategies used to keep you engaged, right? There's also an over reliance of looking at over reporting on violent crime. Homicide only comprises about 1% of all crime, but essentially you're hearing every time it happens. And again, you're not getting reports on, kind of the stuff that's happening every day. Domestic violence oftentimes gets overlooked. Child abuse, right? DUIs, some of the stuff that's happening every day in families like across the world. Um, Even things like looking at school shootings. School shootings are really awful. I don't want to, take away from that at all. But if you look at the research, school is actually one of the most safest places for your kids. And in fact, if you consider what happened with COVID and so many kids having to be in the home, think about like those kids who, only get their food at school, whose, their home life is not safe, right? There's abuse and things like that. You're not hearing about like that kind of stuff, right? But you'll hear about things like school shootings every single time it happens. And I think in a lot of ways we have become kind of numb to it, because I remember like in the beginning when it was Columbine, it was such a shock, and it became a shock, and then it seems like it's happening so often that I think a lot of times for self-preservation we can't really absorb all of this awfulness so far. But again, is the media telling you that school's actually one of the safest places for school or safest places for kids? Probably not, right? It's and obviously even after the last one, I had that, even knowing all of this stuff, I had that thought in my head, should I keep my kid home today? And I'm like, nope, that's the fear. So, I mean, even I experience it, even knowing, the psychology and everything else that's happening with folks. Um, but it's a really hard time. But the media is really going to amplify this, and we're going to watch it, and we're going to watch it over and over and over again. We saw a similar situation with 9/11. Obviously, 9/11 was awful, right? And not okay. But, think about how many times you've seen those planes go through those towers. Many of you weren't even around at that time. I mean, for someone who was, I was 19 when that happened. I have to imagine I've seen it hundreds of times. And after that first year after 9/11, that's all anyone talked about was terrorism. So you're not hearing about that so much, but also think about how it impacted public policy, right? We had things like the Patriot Act, which would allow for the government to essentially spy on you, and we said, yes, please spy on us because I'm not a bad guy. Right. And so you have to think about like stuff like that too. Like we give away our rights sometimes because of fear. Um, and I guess it makes sense, but it's not accurate information. um, the stuff does happen, but it doesn't mean it's most likely to happen to you. So some of the crime myths that we are perpetuated within the media are things like that crime is rampant, it's happening everywhere, it's happening all the time. If you watch the nightly news, this is going to look like, wow, things are really bad out there. Another one is that crime is overly violent. 50% of crime is nonviolent, right? And so we're not necessarily getting that information either. We also have an over reliance on focusing on minorities, so especially African Americans. This has shifted a little bit, but I want to tell you, in the 80s and 90s, this was huge, right? We had shows like Cops, which was reality TV, where cameras just followed law enforcement around low income areas. And again, it's giving off this perception that these are the people who are committing crimes, with very little attention given to white collar criminals or other types of crime. It's really street crime driven. Another one is that teenagers are heavily involved in violent crime. The stats, only about 14% of violent crime is committed by teenagers. Another one is that crime victims are particularly virtuous. Oftentimes, it's small children, white women, the wealthy, beautiful, and it really becomes this good versus evil thing. But really, in terms of victimology, you're most likely to be victimized if you are engaging in the criminal underworld yourself. So, the other thing is, you're not getting the full story. So, when I mention things like kidnapping, yes, children are kidnapped, but 95% of the time they're being kidnapped by an estranged parent, right? And so you're not getting this other side of the story. If folks knew that, these kids were being kidnapped by their parents, they likely wouldn't be so fearful for their own children. And so, again, you're just not getting this full picture. So, as I mentioned before, we saw this really big shift in the 1980s where, all of a sudden the media is being run for profit, it's deregulated. We don't see the same types of journalistic, newsworthy people asking really hard hitting questions, questions that are really going to stump people and get people thinking. But rather, you have cable news networks that they'll have interviewees who are supporting the reporter's point of view. Like, that MSNBC and Fox News have an agenda, right? And it's going to shape the way. And if you don't, watch one of them and watch one particular topic and look at how both of these cable news networks will get certain interviewees who will support their points of view, right? It's not necessarily here's the information, you decide for yourself. It's let's tell you how to think. We also see the overuse of value laden language. And what I mean by that is language that really pulls out emotion. There's a news anchor who's been doing this for years. She has a couple shows, I think. Her name is Nancy Grace. And she gets on there and she says things like, these monsters are preying on our babies. You see how this really changes the dynamic and really gets more emotion involved. And so we see a lot of that value laden language being used, language that's going to influence your perception. We also see misleading and them presenting misleading data, right? So you can hear, like, again, we see there have been definitely some changes and some increases in especially things like gun violence in the US and certain types of violent crime. And so they can say, oh my gosh, crime is on the rise, crime is on the rise. But like I mentioned to you, we still aren't even near the levels that we were in the 1990s. So, yes, there has been an uptick in violent crime, but it is nowhere near where we were even 30 years ago. So it's really important to include kind of the big picture, right? You can say, oh my gosh, there's so much more crime, but you don't also consider, well, there's also been a huge increase in the population. So that's going to matter. Also, things like neglecting various forms of white collar crime, which we have a whole chapter on white collar crime. This really presents and creates a negative view of street crime and essentially poor people, right? Because again, these cameras were only following street crime with little attention being put on things like the folks who created the Great Recession. Very little attention being put on that. Also, failing to provide the social or historical context, right? So, for instance, looking at gun violence without talking about how many guns there are, or not considering, that because of globalization, we've lost a lot of really good paying jobs. Like creating an understanding as to why things may have changed. We don't see a lot of that in on the news, right? But that would give us some understanding, and it would absolutely impact people's perceptions. Lastly, a biased picture of certain types of crime, right? So we see things like sexual assault being very much presented historically in a very biased way. Since Me Too, things have gotten a lot better. I still don't think they're where they need to be. But, it was pretty bad in the 80s and 90s, where if a woman was accusing someone of sexual assault, they would bring up things like, what was she wearing? Did she ask for it? Did she go out with him? Really not taking in the big picture and presenting it in a very biased way, right? Oh, she couldn't have been sexually assaulted. She's a sex worker, right? Like now we have a deeper understanding of some of this, but the way it was presented historically was pretty bad. So, as I mentioned, the media doesn't do a really good job of presenting things like structural factors or even individual characteristics that make people more prone to crime or more prone to victimization. But it's in sociology, it's absolutely really important that we look at the social and the physical characteristics of where people live. What are their resources like there? What are their access to jobs? What are the schools like? Most of us live in communities at this point where we can go, we can point over there and say, that's where all the rich kids go to school, and this is where the poor kids go to school. And if you've had the experience of going to these very different campuses, it's very easy to see that resources are not equitably distributed and that poor kids don't get the best schools, and that's really important to consider why certain kids in certain areas end up in engaging in crime. Do they have after school programs? Do they have sports teams that care about them? Do they have teachers that care about them? All of these come to matter, right? Are their parents working two jobs? Like all of this stuff really matters. But also looking at individual characteristics, things like gender, race, previous personal victimization, how integrated a person is into their community. Do they feel integrated into school? Do they feel like part of their community? Um, because a lot of this, especially in low income areas, it's the community that does the best job at fighting crime, of looking out for each other. But does that community trust the police? Will they call the police in a time of trouble? All of these things come to matter. Or are they too afraid? Are they too afraid to report on the gang violence that they saw because they're afraid of personal victimization? All of this matters. And as I mentioned, the consequences of fear are pretty serious, right? Because it can paralyze society, right? People decide not to go out because they're fearful of crime. Like I said, people don't let their kids go out and play. Um, on top of that, kids build community. I didn't know a bunch of my neighbors until I had a kid because kids want to play with other kids and they're not afraid to go and say hi and whatever. So, um, if you don't have a bunch of kids going out and playing together, you don't have a bunch of parents like as a group overlooking this, right? And you don't have those ties being built within the community. If you're afraid of your neighbor, are you going to go over and make them cookies? Probably not. If you live in a high crime area, you're most likely trying to get out as well. So you see this constant cycle of people moving in and moving out, right? If your main goal is to get the hell out of here, well, that's a problem in terms of building a community. Um, we also know that certain neighborhoods have just a stigma or a threat, right? Like, oh, we don't want you to live there, or I don't want to move there, right? And it's built in, right? So folks who buy houses there don't make as much money in equity and things like that, and so you see this inequality really built up and perpetuated within the system, where no one wants to buy a house there because of the stigma. And again, no one can build any equity. Next, as we talked a lot about, it influences our public opinion. And this is one of the biggest ones I want you to take away from this. It influences how we vote, right? It influences how we perceive and experience the world. And again, we over rely on politicians who say they're going to make us safe. And most people don't vote logically, they vote emotionally. And so, that's important to think about. Lastly, just the effects on our individual lives, right? The fear, the anxiety. There's enough going on in the world to be fearful and scared about. But again, most people, or a lot of people, are very, very fearful of crime. When again, you're most likely to be victimized by someone you know. Even people who we perceive as very vulnerable, like the elderly, are not likely to be targeted, like for violent crime at least. Maybe for other types of like phishing scams and stuff like that, yes, they are vulnerable. But when it comes to violent crime, they're not. Like I said, it's most likely people who are living in these communities who are engaged in the criminal element themselves who are most likely to be victimized. But that's not the message we're getting. And just to recap our chapter summary or objectives, we were able to understand the relationships between public policy or public opinion and public policy, and able to list the criticisms as it relates to democratic theory. We were able to evaluate the accuracy of news media coverage of crime and criminal justice. We became familiar with the over dramatization of crime waves, the over reporting of violent crime myths, and other problems in media coverage. Lastly, appreciating the effects of media coverage, including public ignorance, public fear and concern, and racial and ethnic stereotyping.